In April 1945, as the Second World War in Europe neared its end, Captain Clarence E. Anderson, Jr. stepped onto the grounds of Freeman Army Airfield in Indiana, wearing the same uniform he had worn overseas. He was a decorated fighter pilot of the Tuskegee Airman, one of the first African-American aviators in U.S. military history. Anderson had flown combat missions over Italy, escorting bombers through hostile airspace, where discipline, precision, and leadership mattered more than race. Yet the moment he returned to American soil, he sensed that his authority would be questioned not by enemies, but by his own country. Clarence Anderson's journey to that moment had been shaped by quiet defiance and relentless discipline. Born in 1922 in South Carolina and raised in Washington State, he grew up in a nation that limited expectations for Black Americans long before they reached adulthood. Aviation fascinated him early, but the path was nearly closed by law and custom. When the Army Air Forces reluctantly opened training to black pilots, Tuskegee became both an opportunity and a test. The men there understood they were not simply being trained to fly, they were being evaluated as a social experiment, one mistake away from failure being blamed on their race. Combat in Europe stripped away many illusions. Flying P-51 Mustangs with the 332nd Fighter Group, Anderson was responsible for protecting bomber crews who depended on his judgment under fire. Promotion to captain came not through favoritism, but through performance. He led missions, managed men, and made decisions in seconds that carried permanent consequences. In the air, hierarchy was clear and survival demanded competence. Enemy pilots did not hesitate because of the color of his skin. Anderson later recalled that combat offered a rare clarity. Danger was real, but fairness briefly existed. That clarity disappeared at Freeman Field. The base was designated for training and administration, not combat. Yet it was here that Anderson encountered one of the most defining confrontations of his life. Despite official Army regulations stating that officers' clubs were not segregated, base commanders enforced racial separation through local orders. Black officers were directed to use a separate, inferior facility. The contradiction was unmistakable. Men trusted to lead in war were deemed unfit to share a room in peace. Anderson understood the implications immediately. Accepting the order meant accepting that his rank existed only conditionally. Refusing it meant challenging a system designed to punish dissent quietly and effectively. He had seen how careers stalled, how reports vanished, how reputations were shaped by silence rather than truth. Yet the idea of compliance felt like a betrayal not only of himself, but of every man who had flown under his command, believing that service would earn respect. On April 5, 1945, Anderson and other black officers deliberately entered the Whites-Only Officers Club. Their action was calm, orderly, and deliberate. Military police arrested them without violence, charging them with insubordination. Anderson did not resist. He stood straight, fully aware that this moment would not be remembered with medals or parades. It would exist in records, testimonies, and quiet consequences still unfolding. As night fell over Freeman Field, Anderson waited under confinement, reflecting not on combat, but on contradiction. The war against fascism was nearly over. Another struggle, older, unresolved, and deeply American, was just beginning to surface, and he was now at its center. The morning after the arrests at Freeman Field arrived without ceremony, but the weight of what had happened pressed heavily on Captain Clarence E. Anderson, Jr. and the other detained officers. They were not enemy prisoners or disgraced soldiers returning from failure. They were commissioned officers of the United States Army Air Forces, recently returned from combat in Europe. Yet the paperwork being prepared treated them as men who had violated order rather than defended principle. The contradiction was quiet, procedural, and deeply intentional. Officially, the charge was insubordination. Unofficially, it was defiance of a system that relied on silence to function. Anderson understood this distinction clearly. During his combat service, orders were precise, written, and grounded in mission necessity. At Freeman Field, the segregation order had been delivered verbally, without clear documentation, designed to shift blame downward. The men who enforced it knew the regulations. So did Anderson. That knowledge made obedience feel like complicity. Inside confinement, the officers spoke in measured tones. There were no speeches, No dramatic gestures. Many had flown the same missions, faced the same dangers overseas, and trusted one another with their lives. Now they faced a different risk: career erasure. Anderson listened more than he spoke. His leadership style had always been deliberate, grounded in restraint. He knew that anger would only validate the narrative being built against them. The Army's response moved slowly, but deliberately. Investigations were announced, then delayed. Commanders issued statements that emphasized discipline while avoiding the central issue of segregation. Anderson noticed how language was used as a weapon. Words like orator, conduct, and tradition appeared repeatedly, while the reality of unequal treatment was carefully excluded. It was a familiar pattern, one he had encountered long before the war, now sharpened by bureaucracy. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Some officers were quietly encouraged to sign statements of regret. Others were warned indirectly that future assignments depended on cooperation. Anderson felt the tension of that choice acutely. He had not risked his life over Italy to trade truth for convenience. Yet he also understood the cost of resistance in an institution that documented everything and forgave selectively. What troubled him most was not personal consequence, but precedent. If their arrest stood unchallenged, it would signal that valor ended at the battlefield's edge. That service did not translate into citizenship. That leadership under fire meant nothing in peacetime America. Anderson reflected on the young pilots still training, watching silently. What lesson were they being taught now? As the days passed, the charges remained unresolved. No verdict was announced. No apology offered. The silence was strategic. Anderson sensed that the Army hoped time would do what force could not wear team down. But something else was happening quietly, beyond Freeman Field. The incident was being noticed, recorded, and remembered. And that attention, though invisible for now, was beginning to shift the balance in ways no one at the base fully understood. By mid-April 1945, Captain Clarence E. Anderson, Jr. realized that the Army's most effective response to the Freeman Field incident was not punishment, but delay. No formal court-martial was scheduled. No clear resolution was offered. Instead, days passed under administrative limbo, a familiar tactic within military bureaucracy. For Anderson, who had lived under precise schedules and rigid timelines during combat operations, the uncertainty was deliberate and unsettling. Silence, he understood, was being used as a weapon. The official reports began to circulate quietly. Language was carefully chosen, stripped of context, focused narrowly on failure to comply with orders. The broader issue of segregation was conspicuously absent. Anderson read summaries that framed the incident as a breakdown in discipline rather than a challenge to unlawful practices. The narrative forming on paper bore little resemblance to the reality he had lived. It was not the first time he had seen truth reshaped to preserve appearances, but the stakes had never been so personal. Anderson reflected often on how different leadership felt away from the battlefield. In Europe, authority had been earned through competence and trust. Pilots followed orders because lives depended on them. At Freeman Field, authority seemed detached from purpose, enforced to protect tradition rather than mission success. The contrast gnawed at him. He wondered how an institution capable of adapting to global war could remain inflexible on something as basic as dignity. Word of the arrests slowly reached beyond the base. Other Tuskegee Airmen began to ask questions. Some expressed quiet support. Others warned caution, aware of how easily careers could be derailed. Anderson understood their fear. He had felt it himself, long before he ever climbed into a cockpit. Yet he also sensed something shifting. The incident was exposing contradictions that could no longer be neatly ignored. Privately, Anderson revisited moments from combat, not out of nostalgia, but to anchor himself. He remembered escort missions where bomber crews waved in relief upon seeing the red tails of his squadron. He remembered the responsibility of leading men who trusted him absolutely. Those memories reinforced a simple truth. His leadership had been real. No report could erase that. No silence could undo it. As April drew on, the Army finally began to retreat from escalation. Charges against most of the officers were quietly dropped or reduced. The decision came without ceremony, without acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Anderson noticed what was missing. No admission that the segregation order had been improper. No recognition of the officer's service. No assurance that such incidents would not happen again. The system had chosen containment over correction, yet even in that quiet resolution, Anderson sensed lasting consequences. The Freeman Field incident would not be remembered for dramatic speeches or public trials, but for what it revealed. It showed how Islay heroism could be compartmentalized, honored abroad, and dismissed at home. As Anderson prepared to move forward with his career, he understood that the war had left him with more than memories of combat. It had placed him inside a larger struggle, one that would follow him long after the last shots of World War II faded into history. When the charges from Freeman Field were finally set aside, Captain Clarence E. Anderson, Jr. returned to duty with a record that was technically intact but quietly altered. There was no public vindication, no formal statement clearing his name. The Army simply moved on, as institutions often do when acknowledgement would require accountability. For Anderson, the absence of resolution felt heavier than punishment. The war in Europe was ending, but the meaning of his service remained unsettled. Demobilization reshaped the military rapidly in 1945. Units were disbanded, bases closed, and thousands of men returned to civilian life. Anderson watched as fellow pilots packed away uniforms that had defined them. Some would return to college, others to jobs promised before the war. For black officers, the transition carried additional uncertainty. Military service had offered structure and purpose, but civilian America offered no guarantees that sacrifice would be recognized equally. Anderson chose to remain in uniform. It was not stubbornness, but conviction. He believed that presence mattered, that leaving would allow the system to quietly claim that the problem had resolved itself. Remaining meant navigating an institution still divided by unofficial barriers. Assignments came, but advancement slowed. Performance evaluations praised competence while avoiding endorsement. The pattern was subtle, difficult to challenge directly, and familiar to those who lived within it. Letters from home reflected a similar tension. Family members spoke of pride and relief, but also of limits that had not shifted. Jobs were scarce. Housing remained segregated. Anderson understood that Freeman Field had not been an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a national contradiction. The country celebrated victory abroad while postponing justice at home. He carried that awareness into every briefing room and administrative office he entered. Despite these barriers, Anderson continued to fly. Aviation remained his anchor. In the cockpit, the variables were clear. Altitude, speed, fuel, weather. Skill still mattered. Focus still mattered. He took comfort in that consistency, even as he recognized that flight alone could not insulate him from institutional realities. Leadership, he had learned, extended beyond missions. It included By the late 1940s, conversations about military integration began to surface more openly. Pressure from veterans groups, civil rights organizations, and changing political realities slowly altered the landscape. Anderson observed these shifts cautiously. Progress came not as a breakthrough, but as accumulation. Each challenge, each incident, like Freeman Field, added weight to an argument that could no longer be dismissed as isolated discontent. Looking back, Anderson understood that the war had placed him at a crossroads between service and citizenship. He had proven his value in combat. What remained unresolved was whether the nation would fully accept that proof. As the Army moved toward a new era, his career stood as both testament and question evidence of what had already been achieved, and reminder of how much remained unfinished. By the early 1950s, Clarence E. Anderson, Jr. had become something increasingly rare within the U.S. Air Force, a black combat veteran who chose to stay. Many of the Tuskegee Airmen had already left military service, worn down not by war, but by the quiet resistance of an institution slow to change. Anderson understood their decision. Civilian life offered freedom from uniformed contradiction, even if it came with fewer opportunities. Still, he remained, convinced that absence would only make inequality easier to ignore. The Air Force itself was changing on paper. President Harry S. Truman's 1948 Executive Order, 9981, officially ended segregation in the armed forces, declaring equality of treatment and opportunity. For Anderson, the announcement brought cautious optimism. The order was historic, but he knew that directives did not instantly reshape behavior. Integration would not be a moment, it would be a process measured in assignments, evaluations, and unspoken attitudes that rarely appeared in official reports. As units integrated, Anderson noticed subtle shifts. He was no longer openly barred from facilities, but advancement remained uneven. Leadership positions were technically accessible, yet rarely offered. Praise came carefully worded, often detached from promotion. Anderson recognized the pattern. Progress without momentum. The system had learned how to comply symbolically while resisting structurally. It was a quieter version of Freeman Field. Less visible, but no less real. Despite this, Anderson's professionalism never wavered. He flew training missions, mentored younger pilots, and carried himself with the same discipline that had guided him in combat. Younger officers, both black and white, observed him closely. Some sought advice. Others simply watched, absorbing what it meant to endure without bitterness. Anderson rarely spoke about Freeman Field unless asked. When he did, he focused not on grievance, but on responsibility. Change, he believed, required memory as much as pressure. Outside the military, the nation wrestled with its identity. The early civil rights movement gained momentum, driven in part by veterans who had fought for democracy abroad and returned unwilling to accept second-class citizenship. Anderson followed these developments carefully. He understood that his own career existed within a larger historical current. His service was not isolated. It was part of a collective reckoning still unfolding. As the 1950s progressed, Captain Clarence E. Anderson, Jr. became increasingly aware that his presence carried a meaning far beyond his individual career. He was no longer just an officer performing his duties. He was a symbol, whether he wanted to be or not. For younger black airmen entering an integrated Air Force, Anderson represented both possibility and warning. His survival within the system showed that advancement was possible, but his stalled trajectory revealed how carefully that progress was managed. Anderson felt this weight most acutely in moments of quiet mentorship. Young pilots approached him not with formal complaints, but with careful questions: how to respond to subtle slights, how to balance ambition with restraint, how to endure without becoming invisible. Anderson answered honestly, drawing from experience rather than optimism. He emphasized preparation, discipline, and patience, but never denied the reality they faced. Excellence, he told them, remained necessary, but it was not always sufficient. The Korean War added another layer to this burden. As the United States re-entered armed conflict, the Air Force relied once again on experienced officers. Anderson watched history repeat itself in familiar ways. Black airmen flew missions, trained crews, and accepted risk without hesitation. Yet recognition followed uneven paths. Anderson noted how quickly wartime necessity could override prejudice, and how quickly old patterns returned once urgency faded. The cycle was efficient and deeply ingrained. Privately, Anderson reflected on how leadership had changed since World War II. Combat leadership had been immediate and tangible decisions, measured in seconds, outcomes unmistakable. Institutional leadership was slower, opaque, and resistant to accountability. It required endurance rather than courage, persistence rather than decisiveness. Anderson had mastered both forms, though only one was formally rewarded. Despite these challenges, Anderson's commitment to aviation never diminished. Flying remained a refuge where rules were clear and performance measurable. In the air, trust still mattered. Skill still mattered. Those constants grounded him when administrative realities threatened to erode morale. He understood that his conduct, how he flew, how he spoke, how he carried himself, was being quietly evaluated as evidence for or against those who would follow. By the end of the decade, Anderson recognized that his career had become a bridge between eras. He had entered the military when segregation was explicit and survived into a force that claimed equality while struggling to practice it fully. His service connected those two realities, exposing both the distance traveled and the ground still contested. Anderson never described himself as an activist. He did not march or deliver speeches. His resistance was quieter, embedded in consistency. He showed up, performed, and refused to disappear. In doing so, he challenged the most persistent assumption of all that time alone would solve injustice. His continued presence insisted on something more difficult: acknowledgement. By the early 1960s, Clarence E. Anderson, Jr. had spent more than 2 decades in uniform, yet public recognition of his service remained limited. The nation spoke often of World War II heroism, but the stories most frequently told followed familiar patterns, leaving little room for men like Anderson. He noticed how history was being shaped through books, ceremonies, and commemorations that emphasized victory while simplifying who had carried its weight. The absence was not accidental. It was convenient. Within the Air Force, Anderson's reputation was solid but understated. He was known as reliable, disciplined, and precise. Superiors trusted his judgment, and peers respected his experience. Yet his name rarely appeared in celebratory narratives or promotional spotlights. Anderson understood the difference between being valued and being acknowledged. One ensured continued service. The other shaped legacy. For many black veterans, legacy remained unfinished business. The civil rights movement unfolded alongside his career, reshaping the national conversation in ways that could no longer be ignored. Court decisions, protests, and public debates forced institutions to confront contradictions they had long deferred. Anderson followed these developments closely, recognizing familiar arguments echoed in new language. He did not mistake visibility for resolution. Change, he knew, moved unevenly forward in law, slower in practice. Occasionally, younger officers urged Anderson to speak publicly about his experiences. They believed his story could inspire and educate. Anderson considered these requests carefully. He had never sought attention, but he understood the power of record. Silence protected institutions. Testimony challenged them. When he did speak, he chose accuracy over drama, grounding his words in documented events rather than emotion. Freeman Field, he explained, was not an anomaly. It was a mirror. As retirement approached, Anderson reflected on what service had demanded of him. Combat had required courage. Peace had required he had learned that recognition often lagged behind contribution, sometimes by decades. That delay did not erase achievement, but it altered how it was remembered. Anderson wondered how many stories like his would remain incomplete, waiting for a future willing to listen. The Air Force he prepared to leave was not the one he had joined. Integration was no longer theoretical. Younger airmen entered a service shaped, in part, by struggles they did not witness firsthand. Anderson took quiet satisfaction in that continuity. Progress, though slow, carried traces of those who stayed when leaving would have been simpler. As he transitioned out of active duty, Anderson understood that history does not conclude when service ends. Some battles close with treaties. Others linger in memory, documentation, and delayed recognition. His career had bridged those spaces. The question was no longer whether he had earned acknowledgement, but when the nation would finally be ready to offer it. In the decades after his retirement, Clarence E. Anderson, Jr. watched as public understanding of World War II gradually expanded. New research, documentaries, and veteran testimonies began to complicate the simplified narratives that had dominated for so long. The Tuskegee Airmen, once treated as a footnote, were increasingly recognized as a vital part of the air war in Europe. For Anderson, this shift felt both affirming and incomplete. Recognition was arrive-en-bouteille, long after many who had earned it could no longer witness the change. Anderson followed these developments with measured distance. He understood that history often moves in waves, driven by generational curiosity rather than institutional urgency. When journalists and historians reached out, he emphasized accuracy over sentiment. He spoke of missions, training, and leadership, but also of policies and consequences. Freeman Field, he explained, was not simply a moment of racial tension. It was a test of whether the nation would apply its stated values consistently. The answer, at the time, had been evasive. Public ceremonies honoring the Tuskegee Airmen became more frequent. Medals were awarded, photographs displayed, and speeches delivered. Anderson attended some events quietly, observing how memory was being constructed. He appreciated the acknowledgement, but remained aware of its limits. Celebration without context risked turning struggle into symbolism. Anderson believed that honor carried responsibility to tell the full story, including discomfort and delay. As archives opened and records were re-examined, the Freeman Field incident gained renewed attention. Historians documented how charges had been improperly applied and later dismissed. Official reviews acknowledged procedural failures. These findings mattered to Anderson, not for personal vindication, but for record correction. History, he believed, should not rely on implication. It should rely on evidence. And evidence, at last, was being assembled. Younger generations of airmen began to learn about Freeman Field as part of formal education. Anderson saw this as a meaningful shift. What had once been whispered among veterans was now discussed openly. The lesson extended beyond race. It addressed the tension between authority and principle, obedience and law. As public memory continued to evolve, Anderson remained cautious but hopeful. History, when handled honestly, had the power to instruct as much as it honored. His experience was no longer isolated. It had become part of a larger, documented truth. And while the past could not be rewritten, it could finally be understood with the clarity it had long been denied. As the 20th century drew toward its close, official records began to speak more clearly than they ever had during Clarence E. Anderson Jr.'s active service. Reviews conducted by the Air Force and independent historians revisited incidents once buried under administrative language. Freeman Field was no longer described as a misunderstanding or a breakdown in discipline. It was identified, plainly, as a failure of leadership and adherence to lawful regulation. For Anderson, this shift represented something rare in institutional history: correction without erasure. The language used in these reassessments mattered, where earlier documents had avoided responsibility. Newer analysis acknowledged that segregation orders at Freeman Field violated Army policy even at the time they were enforced. The arrests of black officers were recognized as unjustified. Anderson read these conclusions with restraint. He felt no surge of triumph. What he felt was confirmation that the facts he had lived with for decades were now visible beyond personal memory. These findings altered how the Tuskegee Airmen were positioned within the broader narrative of World War II. They were no longer framed solely as symbols of progress, but as professionals who had operated under contradictory conditions. Combat excellence existed alongside institutional resistance. That duality, long ignored, was finally being addressed. Anderson understood that this reframing mattered not only to veterans, but to how future generations would interpret service and accountability. Privately, Anderson reflected on how much time had passed between action and acknowledgement. Many of the men arrested at Freeman Field had already died. Others had lived entire civilian lives without hearing the institution admit error. The delay underscored a hard truth. Justice deferred does not feel the same as justice denied, but it still carries loss. Recognition could not return opportunities withheld or careers redirected. It could only clarify the record. Yet clarification had its own power. Anderson saw how official acknowledgement influenced education, policy discussion, and leadership training. Freeman Field became a case study, not a footnote. Officers in training were taught that lawful authority must align with ethical command, and that tradition does not override regulation. These lessons, once absent, were now explicit. Anderson recognized that his endurance had contributed, however quietly, to that outcome. As historians documented his career and those of his peers, Anderson noticed a subtle shift in tone. He was no longer described as a man who had endured discrimination, but as an officer who had navigated institutional failure with professionalism intact. That distinction mattered. It restored agency where earlier narratives had emphasized limitation. Anderson had not simply survived history. He had shaped it through presence. Approaching the final years of his life, Anderson understood that the story was nearing completion not in emotion, but in record. The facts were now visible, the contradictions documented, the consequences acknowledged. One final question remained, unresolved but unavoidable. How would the nation choose to remember those who served honorably, even when their country did not? In his later years, Clarence E. Anderson, Jr. lived long enough to witness a rare outcome in American history. A corrected record, not a perfect one, not a complete one, but a public acknowledgement, grounded in documentation rather than symbolism. The Tuskegee Airmen were no longer introduced as an experiment that worked, but as professional aviators who had succeeded despite institutional barriers that should never have existed. Anderson understood the difference. One framing excused the past. The other confronted it. When the nation formally honored the Tuskegee Airmen, Anderson received recognition not as a curiosity of history, but as an officer whose service met the same standards as any other combat veteran. The ceremonies were measured, respectful, and long overdue. He accepted them without bitterness or celebration. For Anderson, the significance lay not in applause, but in accuracy. His life had never been about exception, it had been about qualification. Looking back, Anderson often reflected on how his story could have disappeared. No dramatic trial, no public apology at the time, just paperwork, silence, and time. Freeman Field might have remained an obscure footnote if not for persistence's own, and that of historians determined to reconcile record with reality. He recognized that history does not preserve truth automatically. It preserves what is repeated, what is written, what is finally acknowledged. Anderson's legacy extended beyond aviation. Military academies and leadership programs now referenced Freeman Field as a lesson in lawful command, ethical authority, and the danger of allowing custom to override regulation. Younger officers studied the incident not as a moral fable, but as a real institutional failure with real consequences. Anderson believed this was the most meaningful recognition of all, that his experience would be used to prevent repetition. He also understood that progress is rarely linear. Recognition did not erase decades of delay, nor did it guarantee future fairness, but it did establish a record that could no longer be denied. Anderson's career stood as evidence that competence had always been present, even when opportunity had been withheld. That distinction mattered not only for memory, but for accountability. In private moments, Anderson thought of the men who had stood beside him at Freeman Field. Some had left the service quietly. Others had built lives far from public acknowledgement. Many did not live to see the record corrected. He carried their absence with him, aware that legacy is often shared unevenly.